Hi, everybody. It's Eric Murray from the SugarHuddle.com. Earlier today, I did a story talking about a lot of these NFL mega deals, a lot of these big contract extensions that teams have been handing out to some big time players the last few days. There was also a big blockbuster trade that happened yesterday, so I'm going to get to that first. Khalil Mack, the big time pass rusher for the Oakland Raiders, he's now a Chicago Bear. Him and John Gruden and the Raider management haven't been seeing eye to eye. He's been training camp holdout. And the Raiders and Gruden foolishly decided to trade him away. He's a once-in-a-decade type player, maybe even beyond that. At any rate, they decide to deal him, and they get 2 first-rounders from the Bears. I believe the Bears also give up a third and a sixth. So that's what the Raiders are going to do. We'll see how it works. But first of all, looking at from the Bears' point of view, they had 42 sacks, which was tied for 7th last year in the NFL. So they had a lot of pass rush. I mean, this is a team that has been a defense-first type of team the last few years. That's the main reason why they've won any games the last few years, is mainly because of their defense. They've done some big things defensively. Now they have a new head coach, obviously, and Matt Nagy, who's an offensive-minded guy, but they have Vic Fangio, who helped, was defensive coordinator for the 49ers when they went to the Super Bowl in 2012, had a lot of great defenses in San Francisco, has had a lot of success in the NFL. Now he's going to have both Mack, and he's going to have Leonard Floyd as his 2 edge rushers. Should be an interesting combo. Now, one of the things I mentioned in my article is Leonard Floyd has missed a lot of games in his first 2 years. He was the 8th or 9th overall pick for the Bears in 2016. I believe it was 8th. And he's missed something like 10 or 12 games already in his NFL career. So I think it is 10. So reliability as far as health hasn't quite been there for Floyd, but he's shown flashes. He's had a decent pass rush. I think he has 11.5 sacks in 22 career games. So if he can find a way to somehow hold up for all 16 games, having Khalil Mack opposite him, he has a chance to have a breakout year, possibly even a Pro Bowl type year. So he could have a 10+ sack year. And as for Mack, I mean, this is a guy that he has something like 40.5 sacks in 4 years. He's been a first-team All-Pro the last 2 years. He's been an All-Pro, period, and a Pro Bowler the last 3 years in a row. Has had at least 10.5 sacks or more the last 3 years and had a whole. He's had some forced fumbles last couple of years. He's as good of a pass rusher, as good of a defensive player as there is in the National Football League. Really inexplicable that the Raiders traded him away. Nonetheless, though, I mean, you look at it from the Bears' point of view, now they have a consistent, dynamic, franchise-type defensive player that they know is going to continue to produce for them year in and year out. And, of course, the big news is just hours after they acquired him yesterday, they made him the highest-paid defensive player in NFL history, 6 years, $141 million, $90 million guaranteed, including $60 million guaranteed at signing. And that was just the day after the Rams finally took care of Aaron Donald, who I'll get to in a few moments, and he became the highest paid defensive player in NFL history just the day before. So now all of a sudden, just 24 hours later, all of a sudden that crown belongs, rightfully so, to Khalil Mack, who's just as legitimate as Donald as anybody else. Obviously, Donald was the reigning defensive player of the year, but at any rate, either guy, they can be the highest paid player. Doesn't make a difference, but for Chicago, definitely a big pickup. Now, the downside, of course, is they really need to elevate themselves offensively. They need to see if Mitch Trubisky can take a big step in year 2, see what the Bears' offense can do. It's going to be a tough division still. You got the Packers, you've got the Vikings, who could easily go to the Super Bowl. You got the Lions, who are looking to get back to the playoffs. And the NFC in general is tough, but Chicago's a team that could be a dark horse playoff contender, and this could be something that maybe puts them over the top. One of the big concerns financially is the fact that we've seen them some $100+ million non-quarterbacks that really haven't worked out, and those have been defensive linemen. Albert Haynesworth several years ago, back in 2009 when he signed with the Redskins, 7-year, $100 million deal with $41 million, I think it wasn't guarantees. And then, of course, recently, a couple years ago, you had Ndamukong Suh signing with the Dolphins. He got $114 million with, I think it was $63 million guaranteed. Both times, those moves were total flops, but both guys lacked the work ethic. They lacked the desire to consistently give it all they could and be great. And then Suh, of course, was also a dirty player, so you had that issue too. But then on the other hand, Mario Williams, several years ago, I think it was 2012, signed that $100 and some odd million, just over $100 million contract with the Bills. he gave him a whole lot of sacks his first 3 years. They ended up getting cut after 4 years, but they were a really good defense all those years. I believe he made a Pro Bowl or two during that time span, had a couple of really big sack seasons. And then Von Miller, of course, who's another guy who's just as good as any defensive player in the league. He signed that $114.5 million contract back in 2016, and he's had two really good seasons since then. A lot of tackles. I think he has something like 23.5 sacks or somewhere around there in these last two seasons. So clearly he hasn't shut it down either. So it is a big risk, and it could leave you cash strapped down the line, especially if you're trying to re-sign a lot of the offensive players and what have you. So that will be interesting to see how that works out for the Bears down the line, especially a team that's not ready to be like a Super Bowl type contender right away, obviously. But nonetheless, I think it was worth it for the Bears. I think you got to take a shot. You got to take a shot in the dark, and you've got supposedly your franchise player on offense with Trubisky. Now let's solidify your franchise defensive player and go for somebody like Khalil Mack. So we'll see how it works out, but I think it's a really, really great move for the Chicago Bears. For the Raiders, though, I can't say the same thing. A lot of people are wondering John Gruden's return. I had identified him as both their head coach and GM in my article. Reggie McKenzie's actually still technically considered their GM, and John Gruden's kind of more of the president. But nonetheless, John Gruden's really making all these moves. He's really calling all the shots, so it really doesn't matter how you refer to him. He's basically a glorified GM. But at any rate, I just think it's kind of a foolish move for Gruden because they think they have a team that could definitely make the playoffs this year. And with that division, the AFC West wide open, they certainly could. And it just, I know Gruden's trying to establish a culture and he doesn't want to take any crap from anybody, but he's also a guy that hasn't coached in 10 years, and we don't know if he can really coach anymore in this league in the modern day. We don't know if he can add the wrinkles and different things to kind of modernize his offense a little bit to stay up with the present-day game. It doesn't matter how involved he's been as far as being around the game, being an announcer Monday Night Football. Really doesn't matter. We don't know if he can coach anymore or not. Didn't really have a ton of success in Tampa beyond the Super Bowl in the first year. And again, those were players he inherited. Now he's playing like a GM, player personnel type role, whatever you want to call it, as well as being the head coach. We'll see, but you have to look at the Raiders, and all of a sudden, this is a team that even with Mac had a bad defense. Let's just call it what it is. And now it's a defense that's going to be really, really bad without Mac because you aren't going to have that primary pass rusher. So all of a sudden, you're looking at it and say, okay, well, the Raiders maybe had a good shot at being a 9-7 team. Maybe that would have been enough to make the playoffs, possibly even steal the division. But now you have to look at it and say 7-9, 8-8 might be the best they can do, because unless Derek Carr plays out of his mind like he did a couple of years ago, if he plays more like he did last year, which, to be fair, he did make the Pro Bowl, but it wasn't really an amazing season by any means, kind of a wide-open year for AFC quarterbacks as far as the Pro Bowl, then they're not going to be able to make any sort of real run to the playoffs, and they'll be a losing football team. And a lot of people are questioning Gruden. Gruden keeps adding all these veteran players that are all 30 or well over 30 years old. And you've got Mac, who's only 27, once in a at least once in a decade type player, maybe even once in a generation. I don't know. That's up for debate, but at least once in a decade type player, and you run him out of town doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense. I get the whole thing about Derek Carr's already getting paid a ton of money, and then you pay Mac a ton of money, and that's really going to screw you on the cap. So I get that side of the argument, but John Gruden, some of these moves he's made recently are kind of questionable. You think about Martavis Bryant, who he gave a third-rounder for, even though he's a troubled receiver who's been suspended before, gave up a third-rounder back in the spring, gave him up to the Steelers, gave up a third-rounder to the Steelers to get Martavis Bryant, and then what does he do? Martavis Bryant ends up being one of the final roster cut-downs yesterday. And then Ryan Switzer, who was a guy that they got from the Cowboys in the offseason, return man, really good player. And then Gruden kind of curiously trades him to the Steelers, speaking of Pittsburgh. And then, of course, they trade for A.J. McCarron, who's a guy who I've always liked, but not really much of an upgrade from what they have now as far as their backup quarterbacks. And you just wonder, was that move really worth making, as incompetent as your backups are now? Maybe there's somebody else you could have gotten. I don't know. Not a bad move, but the thing is, we know Carr misses usually at least 1 or 2 games a year, so that could be something that McCarron has to play. That might not work out too well for the Raiders. We'll see. But at any rate, don't think John Gruden's been having a real good week with some of his decisions he's made. And it's almost like the Raiders are kind of playing for a little bit more of a rebuild than actually competing for a division title this year. Really, really hard to say. It's kind of really, really up in the air. And then, of course, there were several other moves that have been made in the last several days. I mentioned Aaron Donald. Aaron Donald, for all of maybe 24 hours, if that, was the highest paid player in NFL history, highest paid defense player in NFL history. I believe it. Yeah, it was 6 years, $135 million. Can't remember off the top of my head what the total. I think it was $87 million total guaranteed. I'm not sure what it was at signing, but nonetheless, he's getting a truckload of money. Reigning defensive player of the year, just an unbelievably dominant defensive tackle. I mean, he's putting up sack numbers that you just don't see out of defensive linemen. I think he has something like 39 sacks in 4 years, somewhere around there. I mean, it's just insane numbers for a defensive tackle. Really just unbelievable for a defensive tackle to put up those sort of numbers. And nonetheless, very, very dominant player. And he's a guy that the Rams had to take care of. They had to lock up at some point. He's been holding out all of camp. We'll see if there's a little bit of rust attached to him this season. But remember, he held out last year, missed the first couple games, and he ended up being Defensive Player of the Year. So obviously it worked out pretty darn good for him. So I think he'll be fine coming back. And the same with Mac. I don't think they're going to really deal with any kind of early season injuries from not really participating in camp. So really the thing you have to look at is, okay, it makes a lot of sense for the Rams to make this move, but what does it mean for the Rams as a team? And the thing that's interesting with the Rams is they've got a loaded football team, but they're giving all of their players these big long-term contracts left and right. And these guys, for the most part, are very deserving of the contracts. But the thing is, when you're signing all these guys, especially in the NFL, you're giving all your players these contract extensions simultaneously, and then you have this young hotshot coach who had all this success in his first year as a head coach. You know, Jason Whitlock from Fox Sports 1, he pointed this out, and I totally agree with him, are the Rams getting fat and happy? Are they getting content? Are they kind of feeling themselves a little bit too much? And with all these guys getting paid, are they going to have this burning desire to compete for a Super Bowl and go all out this year and in the next few years? And then, of course, their cap situation is eventually going to be a mess because they're giving out so many big contracts. Eventually, that's going to catch up to them. We'll see how it plays out in a few years. Eventually, they're going to have to give Jared Goff a big deal in a couple years. So that is an interesting point. One of the things I remember Whitlock pointing out within the last few weeks is following the Kansas City Chiefs in the early 2000s with Dick Vermeil. They were really, really good, and they thought, okay, they've got the league figured out. They're going to win a Super Bowl. Nobody can stop them. They have this great offense, this great team. All these guys are getting big contracts, and then they just ended up kind of flopping and couldn't win in the postseason. And then eventually they had to kind of tear that team apart. So you wonder, is that a concern with the Rams? So one thing I would be concerned with this Donald contract, on top of all the big contract extensions they gave recently, Rob Havenstein, right tackle, Todd Gurley, running back, obviously, and then Brandon Cooks, a receiver who they traded for, gave him a big extension. You just have to wonder, is their window of opportunity closing a lot sooner than we think because of all these deals are giving out and because you don't know how certain guys are going to react as far as, are they going to get content because they're getting paid now? Maybe they don't have to go all out, because we do see that happen quite a bit in the NFL. I think most of those guys, for the most part, are higher character guys, so I don't think it's going to be an issue for the most part, but I would worry about a possible window of opportunity closing within the next couple of years instead of being wide open for several years. So that would be a concern that I would have with the Rams, but nonetheless, Aaron Donald, they're going to get every penny's worth with Aaron Donald. They're definitely going to get everything out of him, even if they don't win a Super Bowl in this stretch. So at least as far as Aaron Donald goes, they should get their money's worth with him nonetheless. Of course, as far as the offensive side of the ball, Odell Beckham Jr. earlier this week got that $95 million contract, highest paid wide receiver ever. I believe I saw it was like $65 million if it was guaranteed, I believe. Odell Beckham, he's right there with the very best receivers in the NFL. Some would even call him the best, but at the very worst, he's top five, because obviously you got to think about Antonio Brown, Julio Jones, DeAndre Hopkins. So he's right there. It's a kind of a toss-up who the number one guy truly is. So he's a great, great player. I mean, very, very dominant player. We know the things he can do with the crazy catches, and another guy that you can double cover him, but he's still going to find a way to get open and make plays. But at the same time, I mean, he is a head case, and he is a guy that some people think he's mentally unstable. I mean, he's had a lot of real weird outbursts that we've kind of seen on the sidelines, and like we've seen with Des Bryant and T.O. and some of these guys in the past, kind of going off on certain people on the sidelines every once in a while. You just wonder, is he going to remain, is he going to get kind of stable just because he's getting this new contract, or is maturity going to continue to be a major issue for him? And that's the thing that I would be concerned about with this Giants contract, because Eli Manning's getting older and older. If you look at their backup quarterback depth, I like Kyle Lauletta coming out of Richmond, but he had an okay preseason at best. So people aren't really sure about him, and he was just a mid-round draft pick. They end up cutting Davis Webb, their third-round quarterback from last year, which isn't real shocking, only because it's a new regime that's now in there with Pat Shurmur and company, and Dave Gettleman as GM, so it doesn't really shock me. But nonetheless, the Giants really don't have a real backup plan, a real contingency plan for their quarterback of the future. Eli probably will be better this year than last year if all these guys stay healthy this year, like Beckham and Evan Ingram and Sterling Shepard, and obviously much better offensive line this year. But nonetheless, Eli's getting up there in age. He's 37, 38 now, somewhere around there, and he just has looked old and looked done for the last several years. Even when they made the playoffs a couple years ago, he really wasn't the reason why they got to the playoffs, even with an 11-5 season like they had. But you look at Beckham, very productive player. He had, I believe it was at least 90 catches, at least 1,305 yards, and at least 10 touchdowns each of his first 3 years in the NFL. And then last year, he missed the final 12 games of the year. He still had 25 catches, 302 yards, and 3 touchdowns in 4 games, so he still had big production. But at any rate, he's a guy who's missed 17 games in 4 years, including the 12 last season. So durability isn't really on his side. Stability, again, from a mental standpoint, from a maturity standpoint, isn't on his side. Big thing with him is they haven't won a whole lot with him. And again, with a receiver, you can't put it on the receiver too much. But their only playoff year since he's been there was 2 years ago. And of course, he laid an egg in the wild card playoff game at Green Bay. He had 4 catches, 28 yards. He was targeted 11 times. I remember he had multiple drops. I want to say he had something like 3 drops, which is just so uncharacteristic of him. But he wasn't very focused, because remember, that whole week, the big thing was that party boat, that yacht that he was on. I believe it was at the beginning of the week leading up to the playoff game. He was on this party boat. He's on this yacht. And so everybody, I think he was with Justin Bieber of all people. But anyways, the big thing was people said, okay, this guy, he just doesn't get it. This is a playoff game. You got to be locked in. You can do all that partying right after the season ends. Why are you picking this time to do this? I know he's human and all, but still, you can't be doing that. It's a bad look. And then he plays terribly in the playoff game. If he would have played out of his mind, then they would have said, go on a party boat every single week. But that didn't happen. He laid an egg. They lost the playoff game. And that's really all the Giants have done relevance-wise since he's been there. They were 0-4 last year, even with him. They ended up losing 13 games last year, a franchise record. So I think Odell Beckham Jr. is still a hell of a receiver, and I can't really blame the Giants for giving him this big contract. And especially eventually, once they replace Eli, they're going to need their next quarterback to definitely have a big-time, great receiver like Odell Beckham Jr. So it definitely makes a lot of sense to give him the contract. But at the same time, I also would be concerned just for the simple fact that I just don't know if he's going to stay healthy enough on a year in and year out basis. Is he going to be all there mentally? Is he going to improve maturity-wise, get his act together? So until they really kind of figure out the rest of their team, figure out the future beyond Eli, see if Pat Shurmur, who failed as a head coach once before, can get it done this time. So Beckham alone isn't going to be a reason, is going to be the reason why they win a Super Bowl. It's going to have to be well beyond him. And the track record of these non-quarterbacks that are getting these $90, $95, $100+ million contracts, like I mentioned with Sue and Albert Haynesworth, not a real great, very all over the place type of track record. So we'll see. It's a very risky move for the Giants. But one thing I mentioned in my article is I wouldn't really expect the Giants to win a Super Bowl anytime soon until they get some other things figured out that go way beyond Odell Beckham Jr. We'll see what happens there. And then, of course, Aaron Rodgers, highest paid player, period, in NFL history, 4-year, $134 million deal, could be worth up to $180, $103 million of it fully guaranteed. He's a great quarterback. I mean, Rodgers is awesome, hell of a quarterback. even with Brady and a couple of these other guys, you can argue that Rodgers has already been the best quarterback in football for the last several years. But at the same time, what concerns me about it is, again, you can't blame these players because they're just taking the money that the team's offering them. But at the same time, it definitely hurts them salary cap wise because the Packers, you just have to wonder, okay, how are they going to invest any more resources when they're paying Rodgers all this money, especially considering that they haven't exactly knocked it out of the park with their drafts in recent years. So they basically have to kill it in their draft every single year and find some real good low buck veterans, because if not, they're going to be getting rid of a lot of homegrown players, and they're not going to get any better. This is a team that obviously last year Rodgers missed 9 games. They ended up having their first losing season since 2008, which was Rodgers' first year as a starter. Remember, they had a streak of 9 consecutive playoff seasons from 2009 through 2017. Rodgers, obviously two-time MVP, Super Bowl 45 MVP when they beat the Steelers back in 2010 season. But that's 2010. That's 8 years ago. That seems like a lifetime ago. They've had a lot of opportunities since then to make Super Bowl runs. They had that magical 15-1 season the very next year where they started 14-0 before they lost to the Chiefs. They ended up losing at home to the Giants in the divisional playoff. A very, very disappointing loss. That was in 2011. They've lost a couple of NFC championship games along the way. They've had some real big disappointments in the divisional playoffs as well. So you have to ask yourself, are they, again, you have to give Rodgers a whole bunch of money. I get that, but are they really going to get any better now that Rodgers is going to have this big, big contract eating up all their cap space for years to come? And the big thing, too, is Rodgers' durability. He's going to be 35 in December, which isn't the end of the world, but still 35 in December. Missed 9 games last year, missed 7 games back in 2013. Did play every game between 14 and 16, but nonetheless, even those seasons, he kind of had some nagging injuries, and those were years where sometimes they didn't always get off to hot starts, and they had to kind of dig themselves out of holes. Kind of like we've seen a little bit with Carolina Panthers and Cam Newton from time to time, where he's been healthy, but they've gotten off to slow starts and kind of gotten hot down the stretch. Any rate, though, so I am concerned about the financial consequences that could come with this, just like some of these other deals. At least it is a quarterback, but it just seems so hard to believe, and this shows how hard it is to win in the NFL. It seems hard to believe that Rodgers only has the 1 Super Bowl championship. Better than none, like Dan Marino, but nonetheless, you would think he would have like 4 by now. We'll see how that goes. Then finally, the last thing I wanted to point out as far as these contract extensions, Cincinnati Bengals and owner Mike Brown in particular have really been criticized heavily for being very, very frugal financially, for not spending the money, for letting a lot of guys walk like we've seen them do in recent years. Of course, he retained Marvin Lewis, and a lot of people said, why do you do that? No playoff wins since he came to the team in 2003, and they've had all these playoff disappointments. But nonetheless, this might be a new era for Bengal football, because even with Marvin Lewis still around, Mike Brown decided to roll the dice and give long-term contract extensions to 2 of his longtime defensive linemen, 2 guys they drafted in 2010, defensive end Carlos Dunlap, and defensive tackle Geno Atkins. Geno's a guy who's already been to 6 Pro Bowls, great, dominant interior pass rusher, and very much like Aaron Donald in the sense that he has an absurd number of sacks for an interior defense lineman, for a defensive tackle. He's 61 in 8 years, and that includes a year where he missed I think 9 or 10 games. I want to say that was 2013. I can't remember the exact number, but he missed a whole bunch of games that year, more than half the season. Every other year, he hasn't missed a game. But even with all those games he missed that year, still has 61 sacks in 8 years. That's an average of just under 8 a year for a defensive tackle. But this is the thing. His last 3 years have probably been his best 3-year stretch of his career. He had 29 over the last 3 years from 2015 through last year, 2017. So 29 sacks, 3 years, you do the math, that's barely under 10 a year. That's unbelievable. So he's been a great player for a lot of years. Just turned 30 in the offseason, so you assume that he'll be playing a high level for 2 or 3 more years. He signed a 4-year deal back on Tuesday. I think it was either Tuesday or Wednesday. It's a little over $65 million. It was a $16.3 million average annual value. One thing I found interesting when I did the research is that supposedly it's a record, from what I read, for a player over 30 that's a non-quarterback as far as average annual value, something along those lines. But at any rate, I think he's well worth it. And then, of course, Dunlap is a guy that's been very, very consistent. He's also came in 2010, and in 8 years, he's had 5 seasons of 7.5 or more sacks, made back-to-back Pro Bowls in 15 and 16, and even last year he had like 8 sacks, had 7.5 or 8 sacks. Really, really good year. So he's just a strong pass rusher. Remember, Cincinnati is just, they end up with 41 sacks, which would end up being 11th in the NFL last year. Just one behind the Bears, who were tied for 7th, so that just showed you how close those sack numbers were. They have a couple of young guys that are going to play on one side across from Dunlap. They're going to have Jordan Willis, who's going to start across from Dunlap, and then backing him up is Carl Lawson. Carl Lawson, as a rookie last year, had 8 sacks off the bench. Jordan Willis didn't do a whole lot last year because he didn't play a whole lot, but a huge role for him. He's going to be a starter this year. Him, Lawson, Dunlap, Geno Atkins, and young nose tackle, I believe it's the second year in the league, is Andrew Billings, the former Baylor product. They've all had a tremendous preseason, and they all tore up against the Buffalo Bills and their offensive line and really beat up rookie quarterback Josh Allen over a week ago in that preseason week 3 dress rehearsal game. So their defensive line is looking ferocious, and it makes a lot of sense because they still have Andy Dalton. They still have a couple of young running backs there. They still have A.J. Green. But one concern I do have from a financial standpoint, by the way, Dunlap's contract was 3 years, $45 million. But one concern I do have is that Cincy, even with all, they made the 5 playoff appearances in a row from 2011 through 2015 with these 2 guys on the roster. Still haven't gotten that playoff win. They've had back-to-back losing seasons where they haven't gotten any better. Still have Marvin Lewis around, so we don't know. Most people don't really think they're going to be a playoff team this year. They'll be a borderline playoff team at best. So will these moves kind of result in them actually making a run in the playoffs, kind of moving up the NFL food chain? Really, really hard to say. But at any rate, I think it's really worth the risk if you're the Cincinnati Bengals, because both these guys, for the most part, rarely ever miss games. They're both very productive. They're both 30 years old. I think you have to take that chance. And, both guys have been a big part of their defense for several years now. Atkins is a great leader, kind of a heart and soul of your football team type of guy. So I think it's worth the risk if you're the Cincinnati Bengals. But Cincinnati, the one thing is they're going to have to invest a lot in their offensive line in the coming years. They traded for Cordy Glenn, the former Buffalo Bill left tackle. Glenn's missed a lot of games the last couple of years. Obviously, they brought him in the offseason and hoping that he'll stay healthy. Who knows what will happen with that. They drafted Billy Price in the first round, the center of Ohio State. But he's a guy, remember, he had that, I believe it was a pectoral issue where he got injured in the combine, and he's back now and he's fully healthy. But you do wonder, is there going to be those offensive line injuries, which could eventually kind of set your offensive line back to where it was, if not the worst in the NFL, very, very close. Haven't had a running game. So I would still be concerned as far as the offense, as far as maybe having to invest money in linemen. That could hurt, but you can't have enough pass rushers in this league. And a defensive line as dominant as Cincinnati's, it looks like it could get that much more dominant in the next couple of years. You had to invest in those 2 guys. So I do have to give Mike Brown a lot of credit for pulling the trigger and making that move. But anyways, make sure you go to thesugarhuddle.com. Check out all my stories, and also subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'm going to be doing a NFL playoff prediction and Super Bowl prediction. I'm going to have it up on YouTube in the next couple of days. I'm going to have the story tomorrow on thesugarhuddle.com. So anyways, look for all of that. And then also I'm going to soon be posting my AFC South preview video here very, very shortly. So also look for that as well. Actually, I'm probably going to post that before I post this video. So I guess that's a moot point mentioning it. But at any rate, go to sugarhuddle.com and take care.